Welcome to the first lecture here for EMR502. In this lecture, we're going to be looking at content area reading, our shift from the concept of content area reading to sort of the new sort of idea, which is disciplinary literacy. But really what this is all looking at is content area discipline. How do we prepare our students for reading and writing across the content areas? So today's goals, I'm going to give you some backgrounds for current theories on reading across the curriculum. I'm going to introduce the course goals, and I'm going to acquaint you to some of the major assignments in the course and the structure of the course. Before I begin, let me share a little bit about myself. I spent about 20 years in the high school classroom. I taught English language arts in a number of different types of schools, rural, semi-rural, urban. I taught suburban and urban. I taught small. I taught public. I taught large. I taught in private, parochial. So I was across, my husband, early in our career, my husband's job took us back and forth, really between Michigan and Ohio for the most part. But, okay. So I really understand and take to heart this idea that that is in this quote from Louis E. Rath, who was one of the first people to really look at this idea of teaching to think and critical thinking. And here's, if there is something wrong with society, it probably had its origins in the schools. And if the schools were at fault, it was probably because of the way that schools taught reading. And really, I think this reflects two things. It reflects, number one, sort of the foundational nature of literacy to all academic success, but also the fact that what we do in our classrooms, especially when it comes to literacy, it is definitely sort of influenced and part of a larger political culture and climate. And so understanding and navigating those for us as literacy teachers, I think that's really important for us. So I was in the classroom prior to the new learning standards and on the way to the shift to the Common Core. And I was very, very influenced by the Common Core. And there was a lot of implications for the Common Core and then the Ohio New Learning Standards, which were adapted and based on the Common Core state standards. A lot of more significant focus on skills that we would apply to or think about in terms of informational literacies. So drawing inferences, citing evidence, tracing themes across different text types, those are really things that we sort of really kind of would associate with strong research and informational literacy skills. I think that it's important. One of the things I want to point out is one of the interesting things that the Ohio New Learning Standards and the Common Core State Standards did was from 6th grade through 12th grade, I'm not sure if those of you that teach the younger people are aware of this, there's actually English language arts standards that apply to the other disciplines. So there's English language arts standards for the social studies classroom, for the technology classroom, for the science classroom. And those are because there's this like inherent understanding and probably one of the most profound shifts in the learning standards, that these types of skills, that actually they're really important and they're applied in many different ways across the discipline. And so by the time our students are dealing with sort of within these disciplinary specific courses, we need to make sure that they're getting enough practice with all of these literacy skills. So what that means is, and what we call this an integrated model for literacy, that we now want to make sure that our students, that the literacy is a combination of informational texts and informational writing, and that it's not too heavily focused on those traditional literacy, what we would normally associate with English language arts, like fiction and narrative writing. And so what I have here is a stop sign, though, because it's a wonderful shift. Like I said, my favorite change that we've seen in the last 10 years with the Common Core. But it also creates some real challenges for us, and that's why I have the stop sign there, because we have to proceed very carefully. This is a new era. It's a tremendous shift. I think a bigger shift than most of us even really realized at the time. Or maybe those of us that have been formed in the Common Core really understand the profoundness of some of those shifts. So I thought let me just share with you how did my teaching look differently when I was pre-Common Core versus during the Common Core. And so it just shows like 2 works that I taught when I was an English high school teacher, and talk about how I had to change them in response to this idea of an integrated model for literacy. So before the Common Core, I taught The Lord of the Flies by William Golding. Great book. I loved it. Not sure all my students did. But, we could talk at length about the beautiful language in there. We did a lot of passages. We looked at passages. We talked about the story arc. We talked about the symbolism. There's a lot of focus on the symbolism of the characters. Simon, if you've ever read this, Simon being a Christ-like figure, all of that. So that was my focus. And then the Common Core came. And then I had to say, okay, what does this Common Core mean to my instruction? And so what I started to understand is I now have to shift away from just looking at the literature, and now I have to put that literature in conversation. So now I have my students, post Common Core, I now have my students reading some philosophy like John Locke and other philosophers that look at like the nature of society. And then I might look at a TED Talk, that particular TED Talk that I have a picture of. She's talking about the adolescent brain, and so maybe we can kind of understand some of the motivations and actions of the characters based on our understanding of the neuroscience. I might have the students do some short research. So I have a picture there of the library. They had them do some research on maybe children during wartime and look at different wars and what we know about the effects it had on children at the time. Another work that I looked at, that I taught a couple of times, Othello. One of Shakespeare's most prominent plays. It's a tragedy that has stayed beloved, and so prior to the Common Core, I would just look at this, look at the tragedy and the hubris and all of these, the characters, and talk about the language, and maybe focus a lot on what's a monologue versus a soliloquy, things like that. But after the Common Core, I had to shift. I had to move it. I had to bring that into conversation with a lot of different types of texts. And so we might look at, say, this political cartoon that is talking about wealth gap and is talking about the polarization of our society. The picture of Barack Obama, he has a speech that he gave when he was a candidate, when he talked about being a man of color in the United States and what that meant to him. We started to bring it into the conversations about racial justice that are prominent at the time. So there was a definite shift. I was no longer just talking about Othello. I was talking about Othello in conversation with many different things, and I was bringing different types of text into my classroom. Some of them were visual, all of them were informational, and so all of a sudden I had to really start to gain strategies to do a lot of different types of reading, much wider and deeper types of reading than I'd had before. So that leaves us, and it leaves teachers, across the grade bands and across the curriculum, really trying to figure out what are the things that I can do to support my students in this type of reading. Perhaps for me, and as an English teacher, it was now all of a sudden I have to bring philosophy in, and I have to bring in, a science TED Talk. For a social studies teacher, maybe it's like, what are some strategies I can do when I'm using a visual text, or how do I have them engage in meaningful short research projects? So these are things that we need to make sure that we're aware of, that we need to start developing this toolkit of strategies for informational reading. And it's clear to us, at least probably my 2 examples, is clear that some of those traditional reading and writing tests, we've seen them, the next generation tests, they really are a lot more sophisticated than anything that kids took 15, 20 years ago. So one of the things we want to think about is how we got here. Like the Common Core state standard shift and now the Ohio New Learning Standards, we really didn't just get there in a vacuum. We didn't wake up one day and say, "Ooh, we're going to do these changes." It was a gradual shift, and it was a gradual shift that came partly as a result of our understanding of what our students need to be able to be fully functioning and fully participating adults. And so 1872 is really the first instance where we see any kind of sort of formalization of curriculum or standardization of curriculum, and it happened in Chicago, and it was the beginning of what they call the graded courses of study. And so all of a sudden, all of the schools in the Chicago area were, this was what was going to be taught in first grade, second grade, third grade. And so that worked for us because at the time, really, all we really needed is our students to be able to be functionally literate. That's why you saw a lot of recitation, to be able to be fully participating as adults. Most of our students really only needed to be able to do things like read deeds, read ballots, things like that, maybe read a newspaper. By 1889, we were starting to understand that that model sort of was too limiting, that, we're starting the Industrial Revolution, society was getting more and more technologically advanced, and so we started to see elements of pedagogy start to delineate between drills that our students needed to be able to get that sort of recitation, and then maybe knowledge books, what are some information that they need to have. So, it makes sense. We're getting more sophisticated, and really that's where we stayed throughout most of the 20th century. And then the Cold War happened, and then we had the race race to the moon, and the Soviets beat us to it, and all of a sudden you started to see a real focus. And so in 1965 we passed the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, which among the many things included Title I money, where we're now going to identify the students that are at risk of not being able to stay at grade level. We're going to start to talk about what grade level reading looks like, and so we're going to put money into reading and into sort of making sure that our students are meeting the needs. And it makes sense, right? We've become a much more technologically advanced society. You no longer, many jobs, the types of jobs that our students had in 1872, those didn't exist. Even by 1965, we needed a whole new era, a whole new generation of thinkers in our society, and different kinds of thinkers. And then really, Title I, the Elementary Secondary Education Act, that really was sort of the driver for our policy until 1983, when Ronald Reagan commissioned a report that was A Nation at Risk. And that 1983 is really the turning point where we started to see a lot of interest in accountability, because The Nation at Risk, the report, really determined or reported out, and it was something that was very prominently shared all across Washington, that our content area knowledge is lacking, that our students are not leaving school with the kind of content area knowledge. They didn't know their science, math, and social studies the way that we would expect or need them to. And so that's why we started to see a lot of the shifts that now we're living in, right? We're starting to, where we really see the implications of. In 1995, when ESEA was reenacted, that was when we started to see these reading guarantees. So some of you that teach third grade, you know exactly what we're talking about, right? Third grade reading guarantees. And those were things that that came out of the reauthorization of the ESEA. We recognized, though, that there wasn't a lot of tooth to that, and there wasn't a lot of accountability for states. Their reading guarantees looked very different state to state. And so in 2002, that's when we started to see the No Child Left Behind, and that's probably where most of us are very familiar, and we started to see the testing mandates, and as a result, you started to see the accountability measures that states enacted for teachers. So between 2002 and 2010, when we had these testing mandates, and we were really recognizing that that states were, the testing was very different. The testing in Massachusetts and New York State was much more rigorous than the testing in Ohio or Louisiana. And so we started to say, okay, how do we make sure that, since this is, No Child Left Behind is a federal, how do we make sure that there's some kind of federal standard? And so that's when you started to see the Common Core state standards come to fruition. And it, whether there's a lot of revisionist history about whether or not it really did come out of the Governors Association, or if it was kind of more a little bit, nefariously driven by people within the industry. But what happens in 2010 is we start to develop the Common Core state standards, and these standards are supposed to bring us like a national standard. And obviously, that created some pushback. Places like Ohio, we essentially are a Common Core state standard, but by definition we're not, because our new Ohio learning standards are based off the Common Core state standards, but they have a few changes, a few tweaks from them. Where we're at today, and what we're really, really sort of facing the consequences of, is what happened under President Obama with the Every Student Succeeds Act, which replaced ESEA. and that was passed in 2015. And really what that did was create this idea of college and career readiness as being our element. And so now all of a sudden we're not working towards getting our students functionally literate. We want their literacy skills to have them prepared for college and career. And we know that when we say and career, that in today's world, I look at what it takes to service a car today. It's very complicated, and it requires a lot of skill, technical skill. But the thing is that in all of these changes and all these different tweaks, really essentially, this is the NAEP scores. This is a national score, and you might spend your career never ever seeing this being conducted at your schools. It's a small sampling of public schools throughout the country. But it's the same. It's a very longitudinally. It's one of the most longest running and valid measurements we have for the different skills, and there's one for math as well. And what we see is that our reading scores are essentially flat. No matter how much we've tweaked it, no matter how much we've changed the policies, no matter whether we had a testing mandate or not, essentially our students' abilities have remained pretty much flat, and that's something that we need to really address, and we need to explain and understand better. And so the problem then is that what we started to see and understand is some of those things that we did as a result of the policies, like the focus in and the Title I and the early literacies, or maybe the third grade reading guarantees, or the mandates that teachers get, reading endorsements and all of that. What we come to understand is we're dealing with a really, really, really complex problem, because reading and literacy, it really is very, very well integrated. It is also extremely context driven. And so I have this quote, was actually from something from 1954, that not all reading is the same, and success in one area is no guarantee of success in all, because each content area has different demands of the learner. We're seeing that now in Ohio. Our students, our third grade reading guarantee scores are really quite impressive. But unfortunately, what we don't see is we don't see those gains hold on when we test those students in fourth grade, when we test them in seventh grade, when we test them in ninth grade. So because we can get them, ready in the learning to read stage, doesn't necessarily mean that now we have them, that we're able to build off of that and get them reading to learn. So one of the things that we need to understand is that reading is not a single process that can be adapted to different contexts. I wish it was. I wish there was one skill, one strategy that could work. Rather, it's a series of component processes, each of which can be studied in isolation. You're aware of that. We have been looking under, and one of the things I didn't mention earlier, but the reading panel reports, which was released in 2000, we've been talking about the pillars of literacy for 20 years now. We understand that all of these skills work both together and in isolation. And we can have a kid who's really good at phonics but doesn't have the comprehension, or we can have somebody who's capable of comprehension but they lack fluency. We understand all of those things, and it helps us to see, just like I see it as more almost like a system, systems of gears and levers, more than a linear cleanup system. So what we started to shift then is how we look at content area literacy. So content, back in the day, we had content area reading, which went reading in history class, reading in social studies, to content area literacy, meaning, okay, let's look at reading and writing, to where we're at today, which is there's this look at what we call disciplinary literacy. And this is a slightly different look at, and I think a different way to try to understand the way that these different components, how they interact slightly differently depending on the reading context and the reading demands. So what is content versus disciplinary literacy? Probably most of us have grown up and are familiar with the content area literacies. Content literacy looks at reading as a cognitive process, meaning that, it's that complex process that involves, all of these different pillars working together. That's a content approach. The disciplinary literacy says, yes, it's a complex cognitive process, but it's also sort of influenced. You read it involves an epistemology. It's a way of looking at the world. So in the content area approach, It doesn't matter how, if I'm reading in history class or if I'm reading in science class, it doesn't matter how I use those phonemes or fluency or comprehension or vocabulary. I need those skills. But in a disciplinary literacy, I'm going to say, what that says is there's a different way to look at the world. There's a historians read for a different purpose than scientists, and so because a historian reads for a different purpose than a scientist, they're going to engage in those underlying skills, those processes differently, and I need to understand the purpose a little bit more. Content area teachers overtly teach that the process through a series of strategies. And so with content area teachers, what you see are things like strategies that try to get the students, emphasis on things like building the vocabulary, things like that. In a disciplinary literacy, what you see is the teacher not only doing those overt strategy approaches, but also talking about what it means, the purpose, what is. So if I'm trying to prove my hypothesis, right, how am I going, what are the things that I need to emphasize? So they start to focus on what does it mean to read or write like a historian, a scientist, or a mathematician. Content area literacies strategies are the same. So you might see like a KWL chart. That can be used in a history class, it can be used in a science class, it can be used in an English class. And what you see in a disciplinary literacy community is something a little bit more sort of nuanced. You're going to start to see teachers talking about the work as being sort of distinct and talking about, well, how would a historian view this? What would a historian make? How would a philosopher consider this? And so you start to see like they're talking about the discourse in terms of being distinct communities. And then in content literacy, you see the literacy practices are employed to build knowledge in the content area. Whereas in the disciplinary literacy, it's not just about building knowledge. They use that knowledge then to work as apprentice, to practice the kind of thinking and the kind of writing and the kind of communicating that would be typical within the disciplines. We never expect that anybody in high school is going to be fully literate in, say, historical thinking, right? But they're going to practice it. They're going to be a novice. They're going to think a little bit like a historian. They're going to write like a historian. And then they're going to go to science class and they're going to think like a scientist and they're going to write like a scientist, or they're going to create a graph like a scientist would think to create that graph. And so those are all things that, so it's a slightly different but important idea, because the content area versus the disciplinary, and the content, it's the strategies that matter. And in the disciplinary literacy, it's the thinking and the epistemology, the way of looking at the world that really matters. And so you might see the same strategies being used, right? You can see things like a KWL chart, or reciprocal teaching, or a concept-oriented reading. You can see all of those things being done in a classroom that either is content literacy focused or disciplinary literacy focused. And these are important. I have here, I just wanted to show you, like, I just thought I did a reading strategy books, and I'd like you to see, just look for a moment at the sheer number, 507 million results. So we know, we have known for a long time that strategies, and there's a need for teachers to build those strategies. But the difference is just sort of like end in sight. In a content area classroom, building the knowledge is enough. In the disciplinary literacy classroom, you want the kids to have some practice thinking like that discipline, seeing the world a little bit in the way that the discipline asks them to view it. So what is important is that strategies then in either approach, they serve as scaffolds, right? They support our students as they engage in the literacy practices. And I'm a big proponent of disciplinary literacy. I also don't think that we need to worry too much about, is this a disciplinary literacy approach or a content literacy approach? I think it's really about building these supports and understanding that our students need practice and help. And so the big difference that we would see is in a content area approach, what we believe is the cognitive process, the act of going through these scaffolds, gets them ready for the disciplinary work. And it's actually the opposite in disciplinary literacy. We believe that the disciplinary work, so the reading and the writing like a historian or a scientist, prepares them to start to think. It prepares them for the cognitive process of that is sort of engaged in that discipline. So it's just a slightly different shift. And I don't want you to sit there and worry too much about what approach do you buy into. But it's this idea of understanding that we kind of really want to think about cognitive approaches, but we also want to think of processes, but we also kind of want to think about disciplinary work. And what does that disciplinary work look like? What does literacy mean? And how is it different in a science classroom versus a social studies classroom versus, say, a computer classroom, right? And the thing that we need to recognize is that the Common Core standards and its emphasis on short research and everything is really useful, because what we have traditionally presented our students with is not something that would look a lot like what the disciplines would ask. So take history, for example. You, as a historian, you go into these archives and you read full letters and full texts of proclamations. And yet when we have our students in elementary school and high school and we give them history, we usually give them short, like very exerted, already pre-selected, small set tastes of those same archives, right? And so what literacy specialists say is that we give them merely the shell of text comprehended by historians. We don't ask them to engage in the disciplinary literacy. So what we can do now is ask our students brief exercises where we're asking them to read full texts, or we're asking them to do short research assignments where they're actually getting a tasting of some of that work that a historian might do in an archive, right? The other thing is we want to think about how we ask them to write. So I read this article from 1994 about scientific writing and the heuristic, the thinking behind scientific writing. And the difference between, say, the way a scientist writes and, say, an English teacher or an English major might write is that what we have is that in science, writing is a means for developing knowledge. So a scientist might, write as a way to kind of process their study. And you'll see scientists, unlike an English major where they're saying, have your argument and stick to your argument and articulate your argument. Science writing is full of, there's this limitation to the study, and there's this problem with, with the data that I can't quite make out. And they're much more about using the writing as a way to kind of make sense of the knowledge and build their knowledge, as opposed to in, say, an English class where we want to use our writing to demonstrate our knowledge. So when we think about disciplinary literacy, we want to be careful. It's really cool and important and fun, and I think actually the kids really like when you talk to them about, let's kind of think like a scientist today, or let's consider what a philosopher might make of this problem in this textbook or in this storybook. But we have to be careful and understand that our students are never going to be able to fully engage in those literacy practices, because they're going to remain novices. So we can as teachers, we can observe what do the scientists, if I'm a science teacher, I can think about how do a scientist write up their reports. And when I'm a history teacher, I can think about what is the history, how do historians maybe engage in research. But I'm not going to expect my students to actually be able to do that. What I do then is I try to figure out how do I break that down in a way that is accessible to my students so that they can work as novice, as apprentices, as beginners in that way of looking at the world. So one of the things I really like is Elizabeth Moji, and maybe I like her just because her first name is the same as me, but she talks about this idea of our role as teachers. We want to engage our students in thinking within the discipline. We want to engineer or elicit a reason for them to have to think like a mathematician, think like a scientist, think like a literary critic. Then we want to find ways for them to examine texts, examine, their own writing, and then they evaluate. They look to see, what did I learn? Spend some time having them debrief, thinking about what was difficult about approaching this, with the scientific with the scientific brain. What made this more challenging, or what do you think was different when you were looking at this through a historian's lens? So you spend some time having them evaluate their experiences. We're still left with a lot of challenges. For instance, what do we call informational text? I mean, Common Core State Standards talks about informational text, but some schools use memoirs, which are essentially not very different than narrative fiction. What are some of the best practices for vocabulary instruction? We look at some words. There are many words that mean something different in science than they mean in social studies or English. And then obviously we are really at a time where technology is shifting our disciplines, the way that we especially communicate. And, how do we integrate the use of technology? You think about how many times now our students maybe are asked to create a PowerPoint or maybe even do a video of their learning, as opposed to when we would have, the old-fashioned, written response. So we are in a good position as literacy teachers because we are literacy teachers, especially if you come from the ELA classroom, which I know some of you are within the discipline classrooms, but for those of us that come from the ELA classroom, we're uniquely positioned because we always see text and conversation with each other. So you hear a lot of conversation about like the text sets that I presented to you in the beginning that I used in my own classrooms. And we understand that rhetoric and literacy practices, that we need to consider things like author's intent, and we talk about what makes something persuasive, what makes, let's look at the vocabulary that they use, things like that. So the ELA classroom is in a really interesting place, and by ELA classroom, I mean from kindergarten on up, where we can start to really have our students start to see what they read in conversation with each other, start to really look at rhetoric and literacy practices, author's intent, things like that. But still, we obviously are still challenged to be able to teach the students those skills that are unique to ELA. So in this class, we're definitely going to be looking at some of those challenges. We're going to be looking at sort of the historical perspective. Readings will often include short academic selections that I'll pair with the practitioner-based. Our two main readings will be the knowledge gap and the reading nonfiction. Knowledge gap is something that really takes a critical eye at this historical overview that I gave you, and reading nonfiction is very practitioner-oriented and really helps you to kind of like see, well, what could this new way of looking at literacy, what would it look like in my classroom. Some of the major assignments, the vertical view assignment, you can see all the directions on Leo, but you're going to find a partner teacher who teaches in a grade band or a discipline very different than your own. You're going to spend some time interviewing and observing them. You're going to look at the standards that teacher is held accountable to, and really at the end of the day, you're going to create a document that's going to talk about how can a vertical view of literacy help shape my instructional choices. How does understanding what my students' needs might be in a different classroom, how does it help me to be a better teacher in my own classroom? The other thing that you're going to look at is a content area lesson plan, where you're going to create and deliver a plan that demonstrates your response to the essential question: how can we better support our students' understanding of informational texts? You're going to have a documented lesson plan, a presentation that shows how that lesson went when you gave it, and then a 2 to 3 page reflection that kind of ties everything together. And then very modified for the summer, but we have the media literacy assignment, where you're going to look at how can we prepare our students for the literacy challenges of a digital world, where you're going to look at a couple of texts that I'll provide. You're going to go out, find some exemplars of quality teaching materials that really demonstrate your understanding of media literacy as it applies to your grade level, your teaching context, and then you're just going to kind of like think about your own role as a teacher. So that's the class in a really, really, really short nutshell, and I hope that this kind of gave you some sort of background knowledge that can help you as we enter into the conversations in the rest of the semester or course. Thank you, and have a good rest of the week.